Hey guys, Waifugate here again. So today we're going to be going over a Yorion Sultai list for our deck guide for the week. So unfortunately, I don't have a lot of playtime with this deck, but I've enjoyed the little bit that I put in so far. I just spent 2 wild cards on Extinction Event, and for those of you who tune into the stream, there's this whole meme about me not spending resources. So that should give you kind of an indicator on how strong I believe the deck is if I'm willing to spend resources. Pretty frugal. So let's dig right into it. So what does this deck do? So it provides card advantage through Krasis, Nissa, Omen of Sea, Atris, and then a burst with Yorion. So like we can burst in, blink like, 2 Omens and Atris, get a big payoff there, and just keep the card advantage rolling so we can find whatever we need to, whether that be Casualties of War, a Mythos to answer an opposing ECD, anything that we want basically, a Tamiyo who like just cards basically with the Yorion burst, the idea. So it uses high payoff cards like Casualties of Wars to fight other Yorion lists, being able to keep the greed in check in some way. And then you go over the top with the Nissa Krasis. We also have a lot of good answers to aggro main deck with stuff like Extinction Event. Really pushes us ahead. And we're able to find those because we have so much search with like Omens and such, and Thought Erasures to surveil, stuff like that. And then we're also doing the normal thing where we're like, ramping with Growth Spiral, Uro, gaining a bit of life between Uro and Krasis. And then we've got some nice tech like Mythos of Aluna here to copy opposing ECDs, or like an opposing Teferi, maybe bounce something, make it so they can't counter magic us, so we're on the same page. And then we can kind of slam it home with Thought Erasure. So like just being able to bounce something, take it out of their hand, etc. Like it's just very strong. And then we've also got Shark Typhoon here, which allows us to cycle answer Teferi, make a 3/3, whatever. This thing can also just end games because we have Nissa ramp. So we could very easily make like a 15/15 Shark and just smack the opponent like EOT. And there's not a lot that people can really do about that. For the most part in the meta, most of the answers are like, to tokens at least, are like Teferi -3, sometimes like, Forgotten Priest, etc. will stop us from doing the Shark Typhoon thing, but that's only like against that deck. It's not really against the greedy lists, so there's a lot of push and pull, a lot of flexibility that something like Shark Typhoon allows us to get away with. Very nice. So considerations. So there are a lot of cards that should have made the list, or you may be wondering why it's not here in the 75. Most of these are lands. We're running 37 lands, so quite high there. You can maybe trim 1 land, but I like to run more than less in these ramp lists just to make sure we're hitting land drops, and so that we mull a little bit less, because if you see a Growth Spiral with 2 mana, it's kind of rough, and with 37 lands you're allowed to keep that a little more often, etc. So Narset, Risen Reef, Cavalier of Thorns, and Agents are my top, how many is that? Narset, Risen Reef, Cavalier, Agent. My top 4 cards that didn't quite make the deck yet. Yet being the key word, because we might have updates on this. So Narset is the most important one here, I believe, because it counters a lot of the meta. Mainly Cycle. Game 1 Cycle might struggle against Narset. So I just don't know what to trim for it, really. I was thinking maybe a Tamiyo, trimming 1 down to 1, maybe 1 Neutralize. I just like running 4 for that consistency factor, But with Tamiyo, we can -3, get it back potentially. Like there's a lot of recursion in our deck with 2 Tamiyos, so maybe it's -1 Neutralize, and then I don't know, maybe -1 Atris, -1 Shark Typhoon, -1 Krasis. There's a lot we could try to trim for 1 of them, or for 2 Narsets. But it's really nice because Narset can also blink with Yorion, like the flicker effect, to reset her loyalty, so we can keep digging for more cards. She's just really, really good. And she's also good against Yorion Bant, Jeskai Bant, because they won't be able to search their original turn, like, on their main phase to dig for an answer like ECD. Like they can't Omen and then blink Yorion. Like it doesn't give them any card advantage, which kind of shuts them off. So they have to have ECD for Narset, which means they're not ECDing something more important like Nissa, Shark Typhoon, etc. So it's just really good. So Risen Reef's the other consideration. Really, really great because we can blink with Yorion. And it's just ramp. It's nice. It's not guaranteed ramp, but it could be. Could be a big payoff. The reason why I don't think it's good is because it just gets countered so hard by Sakdos. Like Claim the Firstborn, we turn that card alive, which is just terrible. We already struggle a bit with that because of Uro and our tokens from Shark Typhoon, etc. So it's like we're already struggling versus that deck to some point. Basically, the plan against that deck is to wait until we can Thought Erasure and then escape Uro. Once we know that they don't have a claim and they have to top deck it, that's when we kind of go in. So there's that. So and like Mayhem Devil just pings it. Like there's so much that just stops, Risen Reef from being a super competitive contender for me for this deck. So what else? We've got Agent. Agent's the other big consideration. The reason why I don't really like Agent in this list is because we're not blinking a lot, we're not flickering a lot, and we don't have a lot of recursion. What I mean by that is we don't have access to ECD unless our opponent plays it, Elspeth Conquers Death, because then we can Mythos it, but then the chances of that like going to third Saga phase is pretty low because opponent might have a Teferi that can just bounce our token for it, and then we can't replay ECD like it normally can be. Like the Mythos goes to the graveyard and it's kind of sad. And so my idea behind this, why I don't like it, is because Yorion is probably being played on turn 5 or 6 for us if we can just run it out there, because we want to get that card advantage rolling, because we'll run out of gas pretty early if we don't have any like value generators. And Yorion plus Omen or Atris or something else is just too powerful to really ignore. So I feel like we're probably running out Yorion too soon for us to see our 1 or 2 copies of Agent anyway, so I don't really like it that much. And the payoff, like, I would rather just cast Casualties of Warmen, like just blow up lands, make it so my opponent struggles to play more than one thing while I'm answering a Planeswalker. Maybe boning them on like white sources by targeting their white sources so they can't ECD. Like there's so much more I want to do with my turn compared to just Agent, which, I mean, Agent can take away their white source, but it also doesn't deal with a Planeswalker at the same time. You can only do one or the other, or the other. Whereas Casualties hits on all categories, which is nice. So those are the other considerations. There are probably a few other cards, and I'll definitely update the Aether Hub guide and stuff. If you guys don't know, I usually link this deck, the deck that I'm featuring here in the guide. There's going to be a link to it below, and the link below will usually have like a sideboard guide and reasonings behind cards, any updates that we've done, etc. So you'll be able to have access to that too. So now the sideboard is the next thing. So mostly this is teched for, you can see here, this is mostly teched for Yorion Mirrors, Reclamation, Flash, and Sakdos, I would say. And sometimes like just aggro in general with the Heartless. So I'd say if we're not running into a lot of Sakdos lists, whether it be Obosh, Luris, regular Sakdos, whatever the flavor of Sakdos is, we can change a bit of our sideboard, which is like trimming on Cries for other stuff. Basically like anything that could help us versus the other matchups that are popular, like Jeskai Cycle, maybe more Yorion Hate, etc. Like that's what I would trim first, is if we're not running a lot of Soul Guide Lanterns, or running into a lot of Sakdos, which brings us to the sideboard tech, which I just spoiled a bit. So I would say trim some number of Cries and make room for Soul Guide Lanterns. So why would we do this? Soul Guide. So this is an extremely good card. I know a little bit of it's cut off, but it says when Soul Guide enters the battlefield, exile target card from a graveyard, sack it, exile each opponent's graveyard, sacrifice Soul Guide Lantern, draw a card. Like if we tap 1 mana and tap it. So the reason why this card is good in the meta is because it just destroys Cycle. Like they can't get their Zenith Flare to do any damage, because at any moment we can tap Soul Guide Lantern and exile their graveyard. in response to them trying to interact with this card, in response to them casting Zenith Flare, we just make it so that burst of damage no longer exists, and then they can't really recover financially after we remove their graveyard like that. It's also decent versus like Sakdos anyway, because we can maybe exile the cat in response to the trigger. There's just a lot that we can do with the card. It's also not bad versus other decks that can sometimes use their graveyard. Plus, if we don't need it, like we can go to, threaten to exile for an Uro, etc. And then if we don't need to exile their graveyard for some reason, we can always draw a card off of it. Like if we're against Sakdos and we have them locked down in other ways, for example, it's just kind of nice. So the other reason why it's good is because we don't have access to veto. So there's no other way for us to really guarantee to counter the effect of Zenith Flare if we go to dispute it, or if we go to neutralize it. They can respond with a dispute and counter our counter magic, and then they push through damage anyway. Plus we have to hold back all of that mana in order to respond to them, which can slow down our turns, which is something we don't want. So being able to just simply put a 1 mana card that counters their win con into our deck just seems really, really nice and great. So the reason why we have our other slots teched for Yorion is because it's pretty popular. Negates, Mystical Disputes, and Thought Distortion all counter Yorion in some way. I'm not sold on Thought Distortion being great versus the Jeskai version, because if we slam this card, get rid of vetoes, get rid of disputes, whatever they're holding to stop us, neutralizes, etc., they might have an Agent of Treachery in their hand, and they can just play that out anyway and take over our stuff after we've Thought Distortioned them. Now, if we don't have anything for them to take over, if a land is their best grab, it's not so bad because we can pretty much recover from that. That's not the worst. I mean, like Casualties of War in response after hitting another land drop, because they're tapped out after they play Agent, right? Plus they don't have anything else in their hand at that point because we already Thought Distortioned them. So this takes away really powerful cards like ECD, Teferi, etc. And not only does it take it from their hand, it grabs it from their graveyard, so it's harder for them to recur stuff with Elspeth Conquers Death, for example. Just really, really nice. And maybe what we can do is we can Thought Erasure to grab agents, grab creatures anyway, and then grab the rest of their hand with Thought Distortion. They're not running any other creatures aside from Agent, so that's the only thing we have to worry about on the crackback. So as long as we can play accordingly, I think that Thought Distortion is still really, really good. It just blows out the Bant Yorion version because they run like vetoes and all of this other stuff. The only thing it doesn't hit is like Uro, but it also exiles all of the other stuff in their graveyard that's not a land or a creature. So like we can get all those omens, we can get their counter magic, anything that they discarded or used already, it gets exiled, so it's harder for them to escape Uro, which is just nice. So I would say like just some of the stuff that's not super relevant, like maybe Cry isn't as relevant as More because Sakdos has kind of it's in a bit of a lull. Like it's not as popular as it used to be. And I think Extinction Event is pretty good anyway versus that deck. It's just that we need to have some number of sweepers main deck, or we just fold to aggro, which is something I'm not really a fan of. And then having a little bit extra in the sideboard because we're running an 80 card pile. The consistency is nice. And I would say like maybe instead of Dispute, we could run more hand disruption, like Remorses, I would say. Here. That way we can exile stuff from the opponent's hands instead of needing to hold back counter magic, because sometimes counter magic's just dead once Teferi hits. So being able to have a 2 mana card that exiles something from their hand in response to Teferi, maybe get their ECD, so we only have to deal with Teferi once, would be better. Those are the considerations. But like I said, I'll keep you guys all updated on the Aether Hub guide as we go, and I'll probably have a deck like a playthrough of the deck, like maybe a couple matches in another video linked to this one, and like related videos at the end with the end panels, all that fancy stuff. I'll try to hook you guys up because we don't have any gameplay right this second. This is just my opinion on the deck, why I like it, and all of that. Like we already went over it. So I appreciate you guys chilling out. You can always feel free to stop by my Twitch to ask me questions about this deck, about any deck. Maybe you see a spicy list on Aether Hub, you're wondering if I have any updates, etc. Usually stream from 2 a.m. to 10 a.m. Central Time, CT. Other than that, like if you don't feel like stopping by Twitch, always feel free to drop comments or questions down below on YouTube. And I will catch you guys next week. I do one of these deck guide videos each and every week, usually on Mondays, sometimes on Tuesdays, but usually I have it up and running, Monday night. So cheers, and I will see you guys next time.